All right, so we're continuing on with the exoskeleton. We're on page 59 of your lab resource manual. You can see that I crossed out the second picture here, and so we won't be using this model for the perpendicular plate or the superior nasal concha, so you can cross those out. And I want to go through just a couple of the structures on here. We have a new bone here. It forms the posterior part of the roof of the mouth, and that is the horizontal plate. It's in orange, and if you could outline that, that would be helpful to you. And then the rest of the roof of the mouth is made up of the bone called the palatine process. Then we have a big, huge opening here called the foramen magnum, and there's two little kind of smooth surfaces that help you kind of nod your head, and those surfaces are called the occipital condyles. And then you can see some structures that we've already seen on here. We can see letter D is that styloid process. You can see the underside of the mandible, the inferior view, and that is it for this page. On to the next. This is mostly review, but it's a good different angle. So let's do the openings first. So this entire opening here is the nasal cavity. I outlined again the orbit that makes up basically the eye socket. Deep into the orbit, we have that kind of cat-like eye opening, and that is the superior orbital fissure. Then we have, those are all the openings. Then let's go to some of the smaller bones. We can see a good view here of the nasal bone. There's two nasal bones, and I outlined one of them. And then also I want you to see kind of what is going to form the septum. You have two bones there that are going to form the septum. The one that's more anterior, I colored it in here, is called the vomer bone. And then more posterior to that, it goes all the way and divides the nasal cavity into right and left. And that is the perpendicular plate. So that was page 60. Page 61 is mostly a review. So I'm just going to go through these really quickly. Nasal bone. This is that lacrimal bone. We have the ethmoid. We can see in here one of the openings that is the optic nerve is going to go through. That's called the optic foramen. I don't think this is a great view of the superior orbital fissure, but that's that kind of cat-like opening that we talked about in the last slide. Here I outlined the entire zygomatic bone, which is kind of forms most of your cheekbone. And then we can see a little bit of the sphenoid bone from this view. And once again, this is what the vomer bone looks like. It's page 61. All right, now we're getting into some of the openings in the skull. So what we did, I'm going to put this down and I'm going to show you what we did here. We took the top of the skull off, and we're looking at some of these openings, and I'll be kind of going back and forth between the skull and the pictures on this one because the pictures are difficult to get like the right angle. So let's start with, this is the anterior part of the inside of the skull. There's a little structure sticking up. We can see a close-up of it over here. Once again, we're on page 62. The little structure sticking up is called the crista galli, and I outlined the crista galli. Then we can see all kinds of little tiny openings. And those openings actually are for the nerve endings that help you smell. So they go into the nasal cavity, and these openings are called olfactory foramina. And your olfactory bulb and olfactory lobe, we'll find, is associated with your sense of smell. All right, next let's go down here to the middle. This is kind of an indentation right here. It almost looks like a saddle, and that's called the hypophyseal fossa. I'm going to show you that on the skull. And what's kind of interesting about this, I can kind of put my finger right in there. That's that is where actually the pituitary gland sits, which is one of our kind of hormone centers of the brain. All right, now we have a large, good view of the sphenoid bone, and it has parts. This part here, we can see it actually looks kind of like a bat. And this one right here, that's more anterior, is called the lesser wing. And out here on each side is called the greater wing. So those are the lesser and the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. And you might want to just write that in with letters D and E here, write sphenoid bone. Here's that big opening called the foramen magnum. That's where the spinal cord comes into the brain. And then we have some other openings right here, and I'm going to go through these on here, and then I'm going to show you them on the model too. So, letter G. This literally is the opening in the skull that looks exactly like an oval. So it's a perfect oval, and it's called the foramen ovale. And then just past that, just posterior and a little bit lateral to that, is a tiny little perfect circle called the foramen spinosum. Now letter I, we can't see this opening on this viewpoint very well, and I'll show you that though on the model. And this one is more jagged looking, it's more posterior, and the carotid artery goes up into the brain. It supplies the brain with all kinds of good oxygen, and this is called the carotid foramen. And then under here, once again, we don't have a good viewpoint, but I'm going to show it to you on the model. And we have a vessel that drains the brain of deoxygenated blood called the jugular vein, and there's an opening here called the jugular foramen. Let me show you those on the model. So, can you see how this looks like a perfect oval? And we can see one on each side. That is called the foramen ovale. And can you see just to each side of that, there's a perfect tiny little circle, and that is called the foramen spinosum. Now I'm going to show you how the carotid foramen, it looks really jagged on each side, and it's just down here on each side of that hypophyseal fossa. And those are the carotid foramen. And then the jugular foramen, we tilt this up. These are huge. These are the biggest openings that we learned besides this big one called the foramen magnum. So here are the two jugular foramen.